The limping slave no one wanted. Until he reached the fire before it spread. The autumn of 1859 brought an unsettling chill to Millbrook Plantation in southern Virginia. The air carried the scent of dried leaves and wood smoke, mingling with the ever-present smell of labor and desperation that clung to the quarters where enslaved people lived in cramped wooden structures. Samuel was 27 years old, though his body carried the wear of someone much older. His left leg had been shattered 3 years earlier when a wagon wheel rolled over it during a punishment meant for someone else. The bone had healed crooked, leaving him with a pronounced limp. Master Caldwell had wanted to sell him immediately after the injury, but no one would pay for a crippled field worker. So Samuel remained, relegated to lighter duties, fetching water and tending small repairs, tasks that kept him visible yet somehow invisible. The plantation had been experiencing strange occurrences for months. Tools disappeared from locked sheds, food stores vanished overnight, but it was the disappearances of people that truly unsettled everyone. First Moses, a young man who had spoken about running north, vanished after being locked in the punishment shed. When overseers broke down the door the next morning, they found only his shackles, still locked, lying on the dirt floor. 2 weeks later, Clara, a house servant accused of theft, disappeared from her locked room in the main house attic. The door remained bolted from the outside. Master Caldwell raged for days, convinced the enslaved people had developed some elaborate conspiracy. He increased patrols, added more overseers, and instituted brutal punishments for the smallest infractions. Fear became another master on the plantation. Samuel watched all of this from his marginal position, limping between buildings, speaking little, his eyes always downcast, in the practiced manner of someone who had learned that survival meant becoming invisible. But he noticed things others missed. He saw how the night patrols always avoided the northeast corner of the plantation, where an old stone foundation marked the remains of the original homestead. He observed how certain enslaved people, those who had spoken of freedom or resisted in small ways, were always assigned to tasks near the abandoned well behind the old tobacco barn. On a cold November evening, another disappearance occurred. This time it was Thomas, a man who had been planning to buy his freedom and had accumulated nearly enough money through years of extra work. Thomas had made the mistake of letting Master Caldwell know about his savings. Instead of negotiating, Caldwell seized the money and ordered Thomas locked in the cellar of the main house. Samuel had been tasked with bringing water to Thomas that evening. As he limped down the cellar stairs, he heard Thomas whispering urgently from behind the locked door. Thomas claimed he could hear digging sounds beneath the cellar floor, that the earth itself seemed to breathe at night, that shadows moved in ways shadows should not move when no light source changed. Samuel said nothing, simply slid the water bucket through the small opening and limped back upstairs. But Thomas's words stayed with him, adding to the strange observations he had been gathering. By morning, Thomas was gone. The cellar door remained locked from the outside. The window bars showed no signs of tampering. Master Caldwell's fury reached new heights. He gathered everyone in the main yard and declared that these disappearances would stop, or he would start selling families apart until someone confessed. That night, Samuel could not sleep. His leg ached in the cold, and the fear that permeated the quarters was palpable. Around midnight he smelled smoke. It was faint at first, then grew stronger. Through the gap in the boards, he saw flames beginning to lick at the side of the main tobacco barn, the one that held most of the plantation's valuable crop. The alarm had not yet been raised. The night patrols were on the far side of the plantation. Samuel understood in that moment that he faced a choice. He could remain silent and watch Caldwell's empire crumble, or he could raise the alarm, likely saving the plantation, but condemning everyone to continued bondage and Caldwell's increasingly paranoid cruelty. His leg throbbed as he stood. Every instinct told him to stay silent, but he thought of the families in the quarters, of the children who would suffer most if the plantation's economy collapsed, of how Caldwell's desperation might lead to even worse atrocities. He thought of Moses, Clara, and Thomas, and wondered if their disappearances were escapes or something far darker. Samuel limped out into the cold night, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The limp that had made him worthless now became his defining characteristic as he moved as quickly as he could toward the main house. He began shouting, his voice cutting through the November silence, alerting the household to the fire that had just begun to spread. People poured out of buildings, racing toward the barn with buckets and blankets. The fire was caught early enough that only a portion of the barn was damaged, saving most of the tobacco crop. As dawn broke, Caldwell stood surveying the damage, then turned his attention to the limping man who had raised the alarm. For the first time in 3 years, Master Caldwell truly looked at Samuel. In Caldwell's study, surrounded by ledgers and maps, Samuel stood before the desk. Caldwell wanted to know how Samuel had noticed the fire so quickly, whether he knew anything about its origin. Samuel answered carefully, explaining only that he often could not sleep because of pain in his leg, that he had smelled the smoke and acted. Caldwell was not stupid. He offered Samuel a deal. If Samuel could help him understand what was happening, if he could provide information about the disappearances, Caldwell would grant him better quarters, less painful work, perhaps even the possibility of earning his freedom over time. Samuel understood the trap. To provide information meant becoming an informant. To refuse might mark him as complicit. He chose a third path. He said he knew nothing about the disappearances. But if Caldwell allowed him access to move more freely, to observe without constant supervision, he might learn something useful. His limp and lowly status made people less guarded around him. He was, in many ways, invisible. Caldwell granted Samuel limited freedom of movement, with the understanding that any information must be reported directly. Samuel limped out of the study, aware that he had just placed himself in an impossibly dangerous position. Over the following weeks, Samuel used his new freedom carefully. He spent time near the old stone foundation, examining the ground for disturbances. He lingered by the abandoned well, dropping stones and listening. He observed the patterns of the overseers, and slowly he began to understand the truth. The disappearances were not supernatural, nor were they simple escapes. The old stone foundation had a cellar beneath it, one that connected to a network of spaces that predated the current plantation. The abandoned well was a vertical shaft that intersected with these underground spaces. The cellar floor in the main house, where Thomas had heard breathing earth and digging, was directly above another section of this network. Someone had been using these spaces not to help people escape, but to hide them, to make them disappear in ways that would terrify and confuse. But why? And who? Samuel wrestled with these questions as December brought the first snow to Virginia. One night, unable to sleep, Samuel heard voices coming from the direction of the old foundation. He wrapped himself in his thin blanket and limped out into the freezing darkness. Hidden in the underground spaces, accessible through a carefully concealed entrance beneath the collapsed section of the foundation, Samuel found Moses, Clara, and Thomas. They were alive, but barely. They were being held in conditions that made their former quarters seem like luxury, chained in darkness, given just enough food and water to survive. There were others too, people from neighboring plantations. Standing over them was Harland, the head overseer, Caldwell's most trusted man. With him were 2 other overseers. They had created this underground prison not to help enslaved people escape, but to fuel their own scheme. They were staging disappearances to increase paranoia, to make Caldwell more dependent on their protection, and to create a hidden inventory of human beings they could sell to the Deep South, to plantations and mines where questions were never asked. Before Samuel could retreat, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Harland had seen him. In that moment, Samuel knew that he would either die in this underground space or make a choice that would define the rest of his life. Harland's face showed no surprise, only cold calculation. He could kill Samuel or try to recruit him. He decided to use Samuel, believing his freedom of movement could be valuable to their operation. Samuel, after long consideration, appeared to cooperate. It was a calculation that would prove to be their fatal mistake. Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel played his role carefully. He reported minor, insignificant details to Harland while appearing cooperative. But during his movements, he began to plant seeds of information, carefully chosen words dropped in conversations with trusted people. He told Jacob about how strange it was that overseers patrolled certain areas while completely ignoring others. He mentioned to Ruth that he had heard odd sounds beneath the cellar. Samuel also took a direct risk. He broke into Caldwell's study one night while the master slept. He found Harland's reports on plantation finances and noticed discrepancies. Expenses claimed for materials that seemed inflated, notations about slave purchases and sales that did not match the actual population. Samuel carefully left one ledger slightly open on Caldwell's desk, positioned to draw the master's eye the next morning. The next morning Caldwell did notice. His suspicious nature led him to examine it more closely. He began to see the inconsistencies, the financial irregularities, suggesting his most trusted overseer was stealing from him. He began his own quiet investigation. Meanwhile, Samuel's careful distribution of information was having its effect among the enslaved community. People began to watch the overseers differently, to notice patterns they had previously missed. The crisis came on a bitter January night. Harland had decided Samuel knew too much. He and his partners planned to take Samuel to the underground prison that night, but Samuel knew the attempt would come. When they came for him after midnight, claiming they needed his help near the old foundation, he was ready. As Harland led Samuel toward the foundation, lanterns suddenly blazed to life throughout the quarters. Dozens of enslaved people emerged, not with violence but with presence, with witness. They surrounded the scene, making clear that whatever happened to Samuel would be seen, would be known. At the same moment, Master Caldwell appeared from the main house, accompanied by 2 armed men he had hired from outside the plantation. Caldwell had pieced together the financial irregularities and suspicious circumstances. He demanded to know what was happening, why so many people were gathered there in the middle of the night. Harland tried to bluff, but Caldwell ordered the foundation searched. The hidden entrance was discovered. The underground prison was revealed. The chained prisoners were brought up into the cold January air, irrefutable proof of betrayal that shocked even Caldwell. Harland and his conspirators were taken into custody by local authorities, not because the lives of enslaved people suddenly mattered, but because they had stolen property and profits from a white plantation owner. In the aftermath, Samuel found himself in an impossible position. He had helped expose the conspiracy, potentially saved lives, but remained enslaved. Caldwell, grateful but unwilling to acknowledge it too openly, granted Samuel marginally better conditions, but stopped short of freedom. The rescued prisoners were returned to bondage, their ordeal leaving deep scars that would never fully heal. The community tried to support them, but the trauma was profound, a reminder that under slavery, horror could always burrow beneath horror. Samuel continued his life on the plantation, still limping, still bearing the visible mark of the injury that had made him seem worthless. But something had changed. The other enslaved people looked at him differently now, with respect that came from understanding that he had used his marginal position to see what others could not see and to act when action seemed impossible. In the months that followed, Samuel heard rumors of war coming, of tensions between North and South reaching a breaking point. He heard whispers of the Underground Railroad, of actual escape networks run by people who helped rather than exploited. He heard that change was coming, though he did not know if it would arrive in time for him. One evening in early spring, as Samuel sat outside his quarters, watching the sun set over fields that would soon be planted, Jacob came and sat beside him. Finally, Jacob spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. He said that Samuel had done something important, not just by exposing Harlan's conspiracy, but by showing that even those whom the masters considered broken and worthless could still find ways to resist, to observe, to act. Samuel listened, but did not respond. His leg ached as always, but he thought about the choice he had made to raise the alarm about the fire, about the investigation that followed, about the risks he had taken and the people he had helped save. He thought about freedom, not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible thing, something that might someday be within reach. He thought about the message his life had inadvertently sent, that power structures could be observed and understood even by those they claimed to dominate. That information could be a weapon when physical resistance was impossible, that the appearance of worthlessness could become a form of invisibility that allowed for acts of quiet subversion. As darkness fell over Millbrook Plantation, Samuel stood with difficulty and walked slowly back toward his quarters. Behind him, the fields stretched into shadow. Ahead, inside the cramped wooden structure he called home, other people prepared for sleep after another day of forced labor. The system that held them remained intact. But something within that system had shifted. The limping slave no one had wanted had reached the fire before it spread, in ways more profound than anyone had initially understood. He had seen the flames of conspiracy and cruelty burning beneath the surface, and he had found a way to raise an alarm that could be heard even by those who did not want to listen. It was not freedom, not yet, but it was resistance. It was witness. It was the refusal to accept that worthlessness and invisibility were the only options available. Samuel lay on his thin mattress that night, listening to the sounds of people sleeping around him. He thought about Moses, Clara, and Thomas, about the underground prison, about Harlan's cold eyes. He thought about Master Caldwell's reluctant gratitude and the system that allowed such men to own other human beings. And he thought about fire, not the literal flames that had threatened the tobacco barn, but the metaphorical fire of justice and freedom that was beginning to spread across a divided nation. He wondered if he would live to see that fire consume the institution of slavery, or if he would die before the flames reached him. As sleep finally came, Samuel's last conscious thought was about limping. How a disability that had made him worthless had somehow become his salvation. The reason he was overlooked, the reason he could observe and act. There was a lesson in that about how systems of oppression often contained the seeds of their own eventual destruction. The limping slave no one wanted had become the person everyone needed. And in that transformation lay a message about human dignity, resilience, and the power of those whom society too easily dismisses. It was a message written in pain and patience, in observation and careful action, in the choice to raise an alarm when silence might have been safer. It was a message about freedom, not as a gift granted by masters, but as a condition that human beings recognized in each other despite every structure designed to deny it. And it was a message delivered by a man whose limp marked him as damaged goods, whose injury had saved him from being sold away, whose apparent worthlessness had given him the marginal space needed to see clearly and act decisively when the moment came. The fire had not spread, not on that cold November night, but other fires were burning, fires of resistance and rebellion, and the slow, painful awakening to truths that could no longer be ignored. Samuel had reached one fire in time to prevent disaster. The question that remained was whether anyone would reach the other fires in time, or whether they would consume everything before freedom could finally be realized. In the darkness before dawn, Samuel's breathing synchronized with those sleeping around him. A community bound by chains they had not forged, enduring conditions they had not chosen, surviving through connections no master could fully control. The limping slave slept, his damaged legs stretched out to ease the ache, his mind carrying weight no one could take from him. He had learned that being the slave no one wanted could become being the person everyone needed, that margins could become vantage points, that damage and disability did not equal worthlessness. He had learned these lessons through the hard arithmetic of survival, through observation and patience, through the willingness to act when action was both dangerous and necessary. The fire had not spread, the alarm had been raised, the hidden horror had been revealed, and a limping man, whom the world had judged worthless, had proven that human value could not be measured by physical perfection alone. These were the facts, simple and undeniable. Samuel woke with the dawn, his leg stiff and painful as always. He stood slowly, preparing for another day of labor and limitation. But he stood knowing what he had done, knowing what he had seen and revealed, knowing that his limp had not prevented him from reaching the fire before it spread. And in that knowledge lay a truth about human beings and their capacity for observation, for action, for resistance, even when resistance seemed impossible. It was not a happy truth, not a simple truth, but it was earned through experience, validated by events, relevant to questions about freedom and dignity that extended far beyond one plantation in Virginia. The limping slave no one wanted stood in the cold morning light, carrying within him the knowledge of what he had accomplished and the scars of what it had cost. He was not free, but he was not defeated. He was not powerful, but he was not powerless. He was a man who had seen fire and raised the alarm, and in a world built on the forced silence of millions, that active voice, that refusal to let horror continue unwitnessed, that choice to speak even when speaking carried terrible risk, that was its own form of freedom, hard-won and fragile but real nonetheless. The story of the limping slave who reached the fire before it spread was not a story with a neat ending, because the fire of slavery still burned across the nation. But it was a story about the power of observation and careful action, about finding resistance in the margins, about refusing to accept that worthlessness was destiny. And in that refusal, in that stubborn insistence on human dignity, despite every structure designed to deny it, lay a message that would resonate beyond the specific circumstances of Samuel's life, that would speak to anyone who had ever been dismissed as worthless, overlooked as insignificant, or underestimated because of visible damage or apparent disability. The limping slave no one wanted had become the person whose actions mattered most when they mattered most. That transformation, and the lessons it carried about human value and capability, about seeing clearly and acting carefully, about the spaces of resistance that existed even within total systems of control. That was the message carried forward from Millbrook Plantation in the winter of 1859-1860. It was a message written in pain and persistence, in observation and action, in the choice to raise an alarm rather than remain silent. It was a message about fire and freedom, about slavery and dignity, about the ways human beings found to resist even when resistance seemed impossible. And it was a message that Samuel carried within him as he limped into another day, another season, another chapter of a life lived on the knife's edge, between survival and destruction, between silence and voice, between acceptance and resistance.